This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. This week we spend the hour in conversation with photographer Mona Kuhn. Kuhn is an internationally recognized art photographer known for her sublime study of the human form. Her work can be found in collections such as LACMA, the Hammer, and the Getty, where she serves as an independent scholar. Our conversation touches on a number of topics around her past, her motivations, and her methodology. At the end of the episode, I'll be taking a look at some of the week's top art headlines. But first up, seeing someone for who they really are with Mona Kuhn. Mona Kuhn, thank you for joining me today on the podcast to talk about your work and your vision. Mona, a lot of times whenever I'm talking to artists, I like for the artists to be able to introduce themselves with a hypothetical, which is if you're at a dinner party and someone has never seen your work, how do you describe to the unknowing audience what your work consists of and what it looks like?
Well, I think that's one of the hardest questions because whenever you do nudes, it's hard to describe your work as such because there's such a preconceived idea of that. So someone asking me that question on a dinner party, I usually go around it. I just usually say, hi, my name is Mona Kuhn. I'm a fine art photographer. And then they might ask, what kind of work do you do? And then I just usually try to say people or figurative.
One of my earlier podcast guests was an author named Jennifer Higgy, and she has a book about female self-portraiture. And a lot of what she talks about is the male gaze versus the female gaze, right? And maybe you could talk to how, yes, you're photographing nudes, but how maybe your nudes don't necessarily look like the nudes of a photographer that may be stimulated by his male gaze. How do your photographs differ?
Well, when I got into the arts in general, I got into the arts because I liked the idea of timeless. I remember being really young, like in my teenager years, and I grew up in Brazil. My mother was very social. She would, she wouldn't work, but she was very active in doing a lot of social things. And when I was a teenager, she would invite me to come with her, and I actually didn't want it. I was more of a shy teenager, and I wanted to be by myself. And I would often ask her if she could just drop me off by a museum and come pick me up 4 hours later. And in being at the museum at the time, this is in the 80s, it was very empty. And in being empty, I would have this very kind of quiet and calm relationship with the art that was displayed. And every once in a while, I would have this, what I like to call it, a mini levitation. And to me as a teenager, I was like, why is it that I feel a pull towards this work and not to the other one? And what is this mystery? So I realized that there is something that is still communicating from someone that did a painting, let's just say 300 years ago, and then this young person in front of it that I barely knew anything about, art history or too much. I was just a teenager, yet I was able to feel it. So my first introduction to the art was about crossing this element of time. When I got into photography, I realized that it's a fast medium. I like that. I got into photography in my 20s. I felt at the time that I wasted a little bit of time. I didn't start studying art in high school, so I felt that I was already too old to jump into it. So I wanted to jump into it quick and fast, and photography was quick and fast. But at the same time, the reason I fell in love with the art was because of the element of time or timeless. So I wanted to bring that to my photography, and I wanted to somehow stop time, right? Because when I first got into photography, it was about fashion, or it was National Geographic, or it was the magazines, and it was everything that, within a month is gone because another issue is in the newsstand. So I ended up understanding that what I wanted to photograph was the nude because of my first fascination with the element of time. And the nude to me was a way of bringing it all together and stopping time. And it was a way for me not to have differences between people. Like, there is no status symbols. There is, it's very egalitarian. Like, there's no, you cannot really tell. It's like if the human being is the presence, and maybe that image could have been taken 10 or 20 years before or after. There's no, in my work, the way I do it, there's no element of time in it. Now, that being said, I was always interested in the human, not only the human that makes art, but also the human in front of me collaborating with me. So nowadays, fast forward to your question, people, it seems to be a catch sentence now to talk about the male or the female gaze. To me, that doesn't matter. I happen to be inside of my body. I am a woman, so I naturally have a female gaze. I cannot even tell you what a male gaze is because I'm not inside of a man's body. So I can tell you just my own personal experience. I look and respect the person in front of me as a human, and I assume, but I cannot tell for sure, I assume that all of my passion related to the arts, which was a more quiet relationship with it, carries on into how I work and collaborate with the people. But that, if you want to call that a female gaze or not, I'm not sure. That's your interpretation.
Well, I think, when I use the term female gaze, I think I'm coming at it from a perspective that your work is not overtly sexual, right? Your subjects are nude, which I understand as the timelessness. There aren't those context clues to tell us when this image was captured. But your subjects, I don't think anyone feels like your subjects are being exploited. It's almost like we are witnessing you trying to make a connection with your subject, right? That there's something
right.
personal there.
Well, I do think that my, I am a lot more comfortable representing the nude as more minimal, more silent. The people in my work are maybe more pensive, and at times I even dare to say a little bit more monastic, where it is about the simplicity and our bareness. And in that I photograph. I am also like a bit of a minimal person on my way of life, and a bit more frugal as a person as well. So I think that I photograph people with the same quiet and pensive and introspective elements that I have been carrying on with me for quite some time. You have females that are very loud, and you have females that are very quiet. And they're both females, so I think my gaze is more quiet. I like to say my gaze, and yes, I do admit, I do gaze, I do look at people, I am a photographer, I am looking at everything in the world. I'm looking at a bus shelter the same way that I would be looking at someone crossing the street. But I think that when it comes to conversation of gazing, I would just say that mine is more quiet.
Is any part of that influenced by your time with the naturalist community in France? Like, do you feel like that experience with them helped?
Yeah. Well, I think my relationship to just being naked really started a lot earlier than this place that I ended up going to in France. I was born in Brazil. My parents, both of them are German, and on the winter time in Brazil, which is June, July, once in a while, once every 2 years or so, I would go to Germany to visit my grandparents, and we would spend 15 days with them, and my parents would then travel around or see their own friends, and we would stay with my sister, and I would stay with my grandparents. And in Germany, usually the weather is, even though it's summer, continues to be very gray. and we would stay with them, and we would do coloring or whatever it is. And then once in a while, a little bit of sun would peek out, and both of my grandparents would run into the garden, take off all of their clothes, get the closest newspaper that they had, and lounge out in the ocean, lounge into the garden, look back into the house, and say, Mona, Mona, come out, it's the sun, it's vitamin D, take off your clothes. So to me, nudity started with me and my grandparents, and that idea that it is healthy, or that idea that that it is so little that they get, that when they do get, they want to have it exposed all over the body. So that was my introduction to the idea of nudity, which was a very familiar, very in your backyard type of thing. And it also had this idea that they are older than me, so I'm already comfortable with the body in itself, right? With all of the cycles of life. And then when I started my studies, and when I realized that the nude to me is something that over and over again I feel very comfortable with, I feel very at ease with. I also remember I went to Ohio State, then I took a few classes at the Art Institute in San Francisco, and I remember being very frustrated photographing someone at the studio. And I remember thinking that that's not really what I want. I don't want someone, it's very unnatural for someone to come to the studio and disrobe in front of the photographer and then pose in front of a camera, and the photographer is all dressed and the person is disrobed, and you have this kind of, particular situation there. And it felt always a little bit not as legitimate as I would like it to be. I really wanted to go back to, the backyard of my grandparents. And in the mid-90s, I was really lucky to be introduced to a naturist community in France, which is one of the oldest ones. So it's very family-based. And when I entered the place for the first time, I saw a lot of older people in the nudes that come all the time. And it was exactly what I, in a way, was craving, but at the time I wasn't really conscious of it. And I felt at home right away. And then the first person that I met there, his grandmother started going to that place in the 50s. And he was the third generation in his family to be going. So he invited me the next day to have breakfast with him and his grandma. So there I am for the first time with a person that is about my age, and the grandma, both are naked. I wasn't completely naked at the time because I was still getting used to the place, but I was already realizing that I love it and that I feel very much at home. So to me, being introduced to the place has been a wonderful thing because it gave me the opportunity to have a more authentic relationship to the work itself, where I'm not trying to recreate it in a studio, but it's part of my life, and it has become part of my life. So it's like life and art coming together instead of trying to do art in the studio type of thing.
So it sounds like you really want to get the subjects of your work to a place where they're comfortable being in, I think, what you've called a suit of skin, that feeling like they are clothed in their own skin. And at that right. moment of comfort, you can then open up a dialogue about capturing, what's timeless in front of you.
Right. I think the other thing that is interesting, and not a lot of people know this, is that usually photographers are always photographing. And I like to think that between me and the subjects, I like to think that we're friends, and there were people like I'm interested in them, I'm interested in their lives, I'm interested what happened to their parents or the grandparents or the partners that they might have, or are they graduating, or are they starting to work, or 80% of what goes on between them and me is about life. And I think 20% of the time that we spend together, I might pick up the camera, or we might have an idea together and we'll start photographing. So I like to think that